Hello, I'm Shelly Kruger, and I'm the Florida Sea Grant Agent in Monroe County for the University of Florida IFAS Extension. And today we are going to go on a field trip to a salt pan on Big Pine Key in the lower keys of Florida. But first I want to show you some of the scientific equipment that we use to measure these environments. So right here I have a YSI Pro DSS, and the probes that I have on this YSI measure salinity or conductivity, temperature, and dissolved oxygen. So this is one instrument we'll be using today. What we'll be using today is a refractometer. And before you go out in the field, it's always important to calibrate your equipment. So right here I have some distilled water, and I'm going to be measuring this to make sure that it is properly calibrated. So the distilled water has a salinity of 0 parts per thousand, 0 salt. And yes, we verified that this refractometer is calibrated. Today we are taking a field trip to visit a salt pan. As you can see from these images taken from Google Earth, we are going to an area on Big Pine Key, Florida on Long Beach Road. This area is in the Key Deer National Wildlife Refuge and adjacent to Coupon Bight Aquatic Preserve that is managed by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. What is a salt pan? This may be a term many of us are unfamiliar with. A salt pan is an ephemeral wetland that has alternating periods of inundation, rising salinity, and desiccation. Ephemeral means lasting for a short time. Most people may be more familiar with ephemeral wetlands, especially up north. For example, in the springtime after the snow melt, you will have many ephemeral wetlands that only last for a short time in the springtime or after very heavy rains. The abiotic factors of a salt pan may be described as extreme. These areas typically experience extreme events like drought, freshwater and saltwater inundation, and the flora and fauna that survive in a salt pan environment must be adapted for many extremes. Most of these organisms are called halophiles. Halo means salt and phile means loving, so these are essentially organisms that love salty environments. Of course, these plants and animals do not require salty environments, but they are usually outcompeted by other plants when not in a hypersaline environment. The water wasn't deep enough to submerge the probes of the YSI Pro DSS, so I did not get what I would call an accurate reading, but it said the salinity was 27 parts per thousand. I found a very interesting article in the journal Microorganisms entitled "The Salt Pan Microbiome is Structured by Sediment Depth and Minimally Influenced by Variable Hydration," published in 2020 by Weingarten et al. I'm quoting from the article because I think it fully captures the definition of a salt pan. Salt pans are a class of hypersaline wetland that are characterized by their unique hydrology with alternation between ephemeral saturation during storms, tides, salinification, and desiccation when surface water evaporates. Salt pan formation can occur in high marsh plateaus and within shallow depressions of tidal marshes, where salts can become trapped and concentrate when water evaporates. Salt pans are related to the more general class of tidal flats, but are distinguished by their periodically hypersaline conditions and sparse vegetation coverage consisting of only emergent, very salt-tolerant species. The largest snail featured is a Florida crown conch. Melongena corona is a predatory snail, and as you can see here, it has a real feast of augurs to feed on. These minnows swimming around are very salt-tolerant. Mummichugs, sometimes called mud minnows of the Fungulus species, can tolerate salinity from 0 parts per thousand up to 120 parts per thousand, and they can air breathe when the dissolved oxygen in the water approaches 0. Gambusia species, also called mosquito fish, can tolerate salinities up to 80 parts per thousand. For reference, average ocean salinity is 35 parts per thousand. That is more than double the salinity in the Atlantic Ocean adjacent to this salt pan site. Sheep's head minnows, Cyprinodon variegatus, have been documented in salinity up to 80 parts per thousand. Another example of halophytic vegetation is the green buttonwood Conocarpus erectus. As you can see, it is flowering. There are a lot of different species in the Salicornia genus. The common name of this one is pickleweed. Pickleweed is edible. One way it deals with the salt is to exclude it from their plant walls. They are also able to accumulate salt in the vacuoles, and when overfilled with salt, they turn red and fall off the plant. Saltgrass Disticus spicata is another high marsh salt-tolerant plant that is also a very important forage and host plant for the wandering skipper butterfly. The tallest and dominant vegetation you see are the black mangroves, Avicennia germinans, and these are easily identified by their pneumatophores that poke out of the ground like snorkels. These pneumatophores are very similar to snorkels because they bring air into the plant and are an important adaptation for black mangroves. Black mangroves are usually just above the high tide line versus red mangroves, not pictured here, that are able to live in the intertidal. White mangroves grow even higher above the high tide line and cannot tolerate being submerged for very long. As you can see from my video, this salt pan on Big Pine Key is currently flooded. This November we have had more than 9 inches of rain, in part from Hurricane Ada, and in October Tropical Storm Sally dropped 10 inches of rain in the lower Keys. This is also the time of the year with the highest high tides, oftentimes called king tides. While it is true that a salt pan is periodically flooded by fresh water from the rain, a salt pan is called such because the sediments are hypersaline. During a spring tide, the tides bring salt water into the salt pan. Due to the hydrological conditions that allow a salt pan to form, the salt water becomes trapped. The sun evaporates the water component, but the salts do not evaporate and accumulate. Over time, the sediments of the salt pan becomes extremely salty. It becomes so salty that there are very few animals and plants that are able to tolerate such a salty environment, which, as I mentioned before, are called halophiles. As I conclude my video, something to think about is that salt pans may increase with sea level rise as you have saltwater intrusion into areas that were formerly freshwater. On top of the short-term consequences of an inundation of saltwater, which can kill freshwater species like cypress trees, if the saltwater intrudes over and over again, that water evaporates but the salt remains. Over time, the soil becomes too salty to support animals and plants that are not very salt tolerant. Thank you in advance for listening to my video. I hope you have a great day.